Good evening, everybody. So, I am Chamil Ledirmuni on behalf of Sectional Committee, Electrical, Electronics and Telecommunication Engineering Sectional Committee. It is my privilege to welcome you all for the event. I am the chairman of the Sectional Committee, and this is conducted as a hybrid seminar for the purpose of role of a telecom regulator to transform the country to a digital economy. So we have a guest speaker, well-known, renowned speaker, Professor Rohan Samarajiva. So the objectives are we should give and understand about the role of the regulation frameworks, regulations in these developing countries, and how we can get some experience on some other regulations and standards on some other countries. So I will introduce Professor Rohan Samarajiva. Professor Rohan Samarajiva is founding chair of Learn Asia, a think tank actively across South and East Asia, and was its first CEO. He was the chairman of the ICT agency, the apex body for information and communication technology within the government of Sri Lanka in 2018-2019, having been one of its founding directors. He was the team leader at the Ministry of Economic Reforms in 2002-2004, responsible for competition and regulatory aspects of reforms across a large range of sectors. He served as Director General of the Telecommunications Regulatory Commission of Sri Lanka at a critical time in restructuring the sector in 1998-1999. He was associate professor of communication and public policy at the Ohio State University in the US, and a visiting professor of economics of infrastructure at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. He frequently writes and speaks on policy matters at the intersection of economics, law, and technology. His publications include a book in Sinhala on economic strategies appropriate for us, අපට ගැලපෙන ආර්ථික ක්‍රමවේදය. So let us warmly welcome Professor Rohan Samarajiva to conduct this lecture for the for IESL members. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I haven't talked about telecommunications for a long time. I've been more interested in electricity and water and various other matters and how they can be regulated. But that doesn't hurt it, because regulation is not, there's nothing called regulation as applied to telecommunications, regulation as applied to water and so on. Regulation is regulation. It takes different forms depending on the sector, and it also takes different forms depending on the country and the overall environment. So what I'm planning to do is cover three components depending on how much time we have. So the two basic elements are what is regulation, the basic principles, and then to walk you through how this has worked out in Sri Lanka, because as everybody knows, we have had a telecom regulator now for, you could say, about 30 years or even more. So we'll see how that worked out. And then if there is time, we'll deal with some sort of current issues, new issues that have to be dealt with. So the first and most important thing is that regulation cannot be looked at in isolation. You can't just think regulation is going to solve all your problems. Generally speaking, there are three things that have to be done. That is regulation, and regulation must come together with competition. You have to look to see what the competition environment is. Whether it's a single provider, whether there are multiple providers with segmented markets, or whether they are competing with each other. Now in telecommunications, you have companies that are directly competing with each other. In areas like water or electricity, you don't have that kind of competition. So then it takes a different form. Then in each of these cases, you have to look at where there is a possibility of any kind of market power or monopoly power to be exerted. So if you look at the fuel sector, the petroleum sector, you might find that storage terminals, pipelines, etc., need to be paid attention to. The rest of it need not have, doesn't have those qualities. Then you have to pay attention, you have to look at what the regulated entities are. So that's something that a lot of us don't understand, which is that if a regulated entity must be one that can be that is responsive to incentives and disincentives. So for example, if you have a 100% state-owned entity and you fine it or you disallow its costs, it doesn't make any difference to that entity because it doesn't go out of anybody's pocket. It just goes out of one part of the government and goes to another. So while in a telecommunications environment or where there is partial private ownership, so I can remember there was one case where it wasn't a fine per se, but it was a case where we disallowed about $1 million in charges that SLT had imposed on customers wrongly against the tariff, in violation of a tariff. And they had to pay that. They changed their behavior completely as a result of that. It didn't come out of the government's pocket, it came out of the company's pocket. And the Japanese felt it, and Mr. Kamitsuma, who was not a bad person, who I have no personal animosity towards, actually had to depart, possibly as a result of that. 1 million US was pretty big in a country like Sri Lanka, right? So I would argue that if you should have at least partial private ownership if conventional regulation is to be applied. But if you don't have that, you can still have something called benchmark regulation. And if there is interest in talking about benchmark regulation, I can talk about that during the discussion. In telecommunications, we don't really have, we don't need benchmark regulation. Regulation also requires to be very, very fair. Because regulators are standalone, they are not accountable to parliament, they are not elected, etc. They have to always follow proper procedures, always listen to both sides and so on. If they violate that, then we have a problem, right? So usually they are independent. Now let's see what this independent business, oh, anyway. So we'll look at the basic concepts. So everybody who talks about regulation talks about independent regulation. Now I'm going to tell you that there are a few countries in the world. Japan is the only one that actually comes to mind, and Israel, that's it. Japan and Israel, where regulators are not independent. They are just government departments. I have no idea why these two countries are behaving like that, but that's how they do it, right? Probably China is also like that, right? I don't know too much about China, but Japan is party to, this is an international agreement that we belong to, this WTO agreement, GATS agreement. So this is something that is legally binding on us. So this definition, the Japanese also fulfill, because entity or any of the other companies are separate from the regulatory body. So you can't have a situation where the regulatory body is also running the company. You have to have a separation between the two. Now in Sri Lanka, we've had that for a long time. Though there can be arguments that when you appoint the president's brother as the CEO of the company, sometimes that distinction becomes a little difficult to maintain. Why do we need independent regulation? In many cases, there is a need to, this has to do with investors. If you look at the history of this, it's when Suntel and Lankabel are given their licenses in 1996 December that the regulator is strengthened. Earlier, it was just part of the ministry. The regulator is given a sort of independent existence because that was part of the transaction, part of what we promised. Then they said, if it is part of the ministry and SLT is also reporting to the ministry, we will never be treated fairly. So please give us an independent regulator. So that is the main reason, one of the main reasons why this is done. There is a technical term here called administrative expropriation. Now you could say, we know what expropriation is. Expropriation is what we did to the oil companies in 1962. Expropriation is what we did to the plantations in 1972, right? We take over, nationalize. Janasatu karna. Administrative expropriation isn't taking over. It means that gradually, by denying tariff increases or compelling purchases from certain companies. So for example, the minister can say, in the future, all your stationery purchases have to be from that company. I'm the minister and you will make me very, very unhappy if you don't do that. Now that happens to be owned by his brother-in-law or something like that, right? And it is not a market price. It's expropriatory pricing that is offered by that company. But this operator has, even though it's a foreign-owned company or a privately owned company, has to do that. So gradually, the person's capital is being eroded by these various kinds of improper activities. That is what is called expropriation, administrative expropriation. So they, as a safeguard against that, you want to create a independent regulator. This is especially important in infrastructure industries where if you think about it, we'll come up with some numbers as we go, where very large investments are at stake. So until the investment is made, the company, the foreign investor is in a very strong position. The minister is being smiling, everybody is being very nice. But after they invest, now the investment is in the ground, they can't just take it away, take it and leave the country. Now they are in a very weak position. So if you look at, for example, Shell, when they came in 95, they were actually promised a regulator when they came. They didn't insist on the promise being kept right at that moment, right? They were assured all kinds of things. Because as they came in, the government was not in very good shape, the war was going on, they wanted Shell here. So, but Shell didn't press the case. So they never got a regulator, the promises were not kept. The tariff increases that were written into their agreement, they happened in a haphazard manner. And Shell was continually unhappy. And actually they left several years ago, right? Because their negotiating power, their negotiating ability goes down as soon as they come and invest in the country. Before you invest, you have to try to get all these promises done. Because infrastructure investments are long-term investments, right? And the other thing, of course, is basic fairness. If 3 or 4 companies are in the field, like in telecommunications, everybody wants to have a level playing field. So I can remember the competitive companies would come and say, Professor, you know what regulation is. This is back in 98. Look at SLT being given money by the government for their investments. So I said, well, I see that problem because we were taking money from JICA or whoever, and we were giving it to SLT to invest. So I said, yeah, that's correct. I went and had some conversations with people and they said, okay, this money will be given only on commercial rates. So while the government gets it concessionary, you will get it at commercial rates. So I said, now are you happy? They said, no, we are not happy. Because these guys don't have to go behind banks to get the money needed for investment. They now have to pay commercial rates. That's it. We, on the other hand, have to go behind banks and make the argument that we should be given, we have to give the money and then we have to pay competitive market rate. So this level playing field argument keeps coming up in regulation all the time, whenever there is competition. So one of the most important things is proper market design at the point of reform. So we'll argue that I'll go through all these things separately. Second or third best solutions, sometimes we have to work with. Then preset regulatory framework. There's something called discretion, where a regulator can do this or that. My best example of discretion is back in '98, I think, when we were doing the first tariff calculation inside the commission. I had young engineers working with me. Now they are not young anymore. But as we were working on a Saturday, I said, okay, so we had the spreadsheet and I said, now round that up, right? You know, rounding, right? So I said, round it up. So then they came up with some numbers. Then I said, okay, now round it down, right? So then they rounded it down. Now tell me the difference, I said. The difference was in the millions. Between rounding up on that final calculation, the difference was in the millions in a tariff calculation. So I said, now nobody can actually catch whether we rounded up or rounded down, right? And there's no rule in a rule book which says thou shalt always round up, right? So we could actually, this is the amount of discretion, this is the amount of discretion that a regulator has. And we have to be always very careful about exercising that discretion. And my favorite, my preferred method is to have discretion bounded or narrowed. So for example, one of the most controversial things that I had to do in that period was I had to change the domestic tariffs of Sri Lanka Telecom in a way that you would get 25% based on a formula that was in a legal agreement, that it would increase its domestic revenue by 25%. Right? That was, I had no control over that. That was given. Now, how we get to that was my job. So in order to do that, now these numbers will seem like jokes to you. The fixed fee, now I think people in electricity will know there's a two-part tariff. There's a fixed amount and a not fixed amount. The fixed amount on the telecommunication thing was 100 rupees a month. We made it 180. 80% increase. Even if the journalists are not capable of doing math, most of them are not capable of doing math, they could see that is 80% increase, right? It's actually very small. 80 rupees is not a big deal. Because what we were doing was, we were doing the tariff, the actual variable tariff was where most of the action was, and we were trying to keep that under control, and this was the sort of the remainder in the tariff calculation. The last one is the one that sort of takes a hit. So I took a lot of blame for that, right? But if you look at the overall picture, I had to work with that. I couldn't say, well, no, 80 is too much, 80% increase is too much, because I had to give the 20%, 25% revenue increase. I had no discretion left there, right? Then, of course, we need a properly endowed regulatory agency and staff and so on, right? So what are the elements of a proper market design in any regulatory sector? Telecommunication in particular is what we are going to talk about today. Remove, reduce entry-exit barriers as much as possible. That is, if you can give spectrum, give spectrum. based on some kind of standard formula. We'll talk about that in more detail. Don't limit entry as much as you can, but there's another thing that a lot of people don't talk about. Don't put unusual exit barriers. In most of the countries that I work in, I've been an advisor in Bangladesh, Myanmar, all these places. We don't have rules about how companies can exit. Now, if you look at this country, you see that it is a lot left. In Myanmar, Telenor and Ooredoo left. In India, pretty much everybody who came has gone, right? I think Vodafone is still there, but lots of people have come and they've gone. In Nepal, Telenor left. Yes, not Telenor. The company that was here, the Swedish company, they were also in Nepal, they left. But in many of these countries, leaving is not very easy. And when leaving is not very easy, that means that it also is a sort of an entry barrier. Then you have to address problems of essential facilities. Now, this is very important in things like electricity and so on, where you have the transmission network, things that cannot be easily duplicated. In telecommunication, the classic essential facility is the undersea cable and the undersea cable station, the one where it lands. But now we have seen in Sri Lanka, we have a bit of overbuilding and we have now multiple undersea cables landing. So maybe they're not as strong essential facilities as we thought. And then in telecommunications, there are very few if you don't think of that. But in other sectors, there are certain essential facilities, which may have to be sort of subject to strict regulation. Look after the consumer as much as you can through market forces without trying to, regulate every little thing. Just to give an example, those days we had a lot of these communication bureaus. So I don't know, now people don't remember these things. In order to make a phone call, in order to send a fax, I have sent telexes from Salaka, right? I have got faxes sent to me at Salaka, and then Salaka would call me, and then I would go to Salaka and get that. Those kinds of places, there was an attempt to regulate. And what I said is, put the price list and say that you give a receipt. But beyond that, we can't be regulating what those people do. So they were saying, oh, but at night they might charge more. I said, well, if you don't allow them to charge extra at night, they'll close the place. Then what convenience is it for the consumer, right? So tell them at night we are going to charge 150% of the daytime rate. That's fine. The consumer knows he can go to that communication bureau, he can go to the next one. It's near a hospital, he has to call somebody. He has a choice, but he is given information and he's given a receipt. And if the receipt shows that it's been violated, then we will act. But we are not going to go down and try to regulate. Now you've seen what's happening with the government's attempts to regulate egg prices. Not very successful, right? You can't regulate these kinds of things. So look after the consumer through use of market forces. The really important thing is unbundling these three functions. One is called policy, the other is called regulation, and the other is operation. Now, if you look at the telecommunication department in the old days, or the ministry, it used to do all three. The reforms were taking those three paths and separating them. So Sri Lanka Telecom was doing operations and the people who were licensed. The regulatory agency was doing regulation. The ministry was supposed to do only policy. So presetting the regulatory framework means, for example, ideally, interconnection. Now, I don't know whether I have enough time to explain interconnection to this audience. If anybody has a question, please note it down and ask me what interconnection is. It's very, very important. It means it's what's involved in a call made on dialogue terminating on Hutch. And how is Hutch paid for terminating that call? Because in order to finish that call, you have to go through, use some of Hutch facilities. So you have to have some rules about how that is managed. So those kinds of things should be preset, ideally. Now, we didn't do it that way in Sri Lanka, but that would be the ideal solution. I'm doing too well on time. Okay. Don't do very complicated things at the beginning. And again, the regulator should have a very simple set of rules that they're enforcing, nothing very complicated, because I can tell you, I have tried to calculate cost of capital, productivity factors. Those are extremely complicated things that you just can't get everybody to agree on. So these are the kinds of things that we talk about. Insulation from this line ministry. So I can remember there was one meeting, every year we used to, before the budget, all the entities before the ministry, under the ministry would come together and talk about what their plans are for the next year. So the Secretary of the Ministry of Telecommunications said, now, Professor, I said, I'll speak to you separately, but I'm not speaking here because Sri Lanka Telecom is also at the table. That is, for me, I can't do that. So he understood and he had a separate conversation with me. So that means that it's not fully separated, right? It should have its own fund. We can talk about that, whether that worked or not. That is, the regulatory fees are what funds the regulatory agency. Accountability to Parliament through an annual report, ways in which appointments are made. I don't think we can go into all those details, but the slide set should be of use to anybody who wants to get into more detail. You really need to have a good organizational structure, not people who are trying to micromanage the company. One of the basic rules is you don't deal with anybody other than the top management. You don't go down and talk to deputy general managers or anybody like. You just don't do that. That is not part of what a regulator should do. Regulator should only deal with the CEO and that level only. So now let's go through Sri Lanka. That would be more interesting, I think. So Sri Lankan telecom reforms, if you really think about it, have been going on for about 30, 40 years. First was 1980 of all, where before that, if you really want to think about it, it goes even before that. National Savings Bank, today's National Savings Bank, and today's Post Office, and Sri Lanka Telecom were all together when Dr. N.M. Perera became finance minister. He's the one who took the banking function out and made the NSB. That was separated. 1980, they took the postal service and the telecommunications separate. 1986-90, there was something called a shadow board, and if we pulled it off at that point, we would have been the world's first one of the world's first countries to do telecommunication restructuring. So they had a big effort trying to privatize Sri Lanka Telecom, create a regulatory agency, and so on. I had just finished my PhD and I was talking to them. I was actually hoping they would employ me, but because they didn't employ me and I got an offer from the US, I went back. But in the middle of all this, even without a proper law, they gave a license to Celtel. Right? Now, you can ask, who was Celtel? Mr. Manik Divala's son. Right? So you can draw your own conclusion. Anybody know who Mr. Manik Divala was? Mr. Jaya Jayawardena's secretary. Right? So now the act comes, number 25 of 1991. There's a whole lot of excitement before that with, protests, and remember this was a very difficult time, right? Colombo was basically a battleground. So President Premadasa says, no, we'll only cooperatize, we won't privatize. So they created the regulatory body. Office of Director General of Telecommunication was its name, not Telecom Regulatory Commission. And its decisions could be appealed to the Secretary of the Ministry. That means that the final decision maker remained the secretary, Mr. Asoka Gunasekara, who I knew quite well. On the other side, the Department of Telecommunication became Sri Lanka Telecom as a corporation, right? If you look at the Act, the 1991 Act, most of it is about absorption. People who were pensionable could keep their pensions and then they could opt to join the other organization and now get EPF, ETF, you know, that whole business, right? 91 to 96, Mr. Manikavaskar was the Director General of Telecommunication. With very little resources, very few people, they managed to do some extraordinary work. That is, they issued licenses to the incumbent, that is to SLT, 4 mobile operators, 2 fixed operators, 5 facilities-based data operators, and so on. They issued licenses. That's not a small thing to do, right? So competition was happening on the edges. These 2 fixed operators, that's direct competition, they had a restriction that to some extent still remains. It said that they can't connect to the consumer, their customers, using wires. So the unions were saying, oh, okay, that's not real competition. So we get to put the wire, they don't get to put a wire. They have to go wireless, right? So the idea was that that would be removed after some time, but technically it's still there, right? Today, Lanka Bell wants to go and put a wire into your house, they can't do it. Interconnection was a mess, tariff regulation had not been done, various kinds of things, right? I mean, I'm not blaming them, they really didn't have the resources. 2 wireless local loop operators, Suntel and Lanka Bell, were given licenses. I would say that is a pretty clear, clean process, perhaps the only one that we've had. Now, earlier I said something about the first license that was given, but this one was pretty clear. They bid. There was a third bidder, Maharajas, who were disqualified on technical grounds. And then while they were appealing it, the injunction was lifted and then these 2 licenses were issued, right? The act was amended, strengthened the regulatory agency, gave its own fund, made it a collegial commission of 5 people, that is 1 full-time person and 4 part-time persons. The chairman was ex officio the secretary, but no longer were appeals allowed to the secretary, and so on. So it's a much stronger thing, but not as strong as it should be, not as independent as it should be, because when you have the ministry secretary as the chairman, you don't really have a lot of independence, but we managed. Now, again, these numbers, when I was putting it in, I was saying, oh my God, look at that. They had only 250,000 lines. Only 250,000. Actually, in 1980, they had only 60,000, I think, for the whole country. 60,000 telephone lines, customers. Here it was 250,000, right? You know, there are 5 million households in this country. So this was the number, right? So obviously you had to have more, and there was a big pressure coming from the corporate sector. They just couldn't work with the service quality that they had. So if you were, now they had decided on privatization, but if privatization was to be done, you had to do something called tariff rebalancing. Over 60% of SLT's revenues came from international. Over 60%. And less than 10% of their customers had IDD accounts. Of that 225,000, maybe 20,000 or somebody had IDD accounts. But even the others could receive calls. So it's on the receiving calls that SLT made its money. And everybody knew this couldn't go on because termination rates were coming down all over the world, and so on. So it was necessary to privatize. So we have about 10 minutes. No? So this was, I'm going to go relatively fast now. So this was, I think, given today's discussion where everybody is interested in further reform, further restructuring of SLT, this would be of interest. 35% of the shares and management control for 5 years went to NTT. They had a de facto monopoly on international and fixed wireline for 5 years. 3.5% of the shares were given to employees. The senior people got more and junior people got less. IPO was to be done in 2000. Privatization took about 2 years to do. Yeah, so mid 1995 to 97, middle 97 August. It took 2.5 years. Government valuation was that it would fetch 110 million. The million is missing here. 110 million US dollars. The international advisors came up with a higher number, about 160. France Telecom gave it at 160, but NTT, the winning bidder, offered 225. That was the largest transaction. I don't even know whether that still might be the largest transaction of an existing company that we've ever had. So after privatization, 40 billion was invested, new connections were given, quality of service improved, lines per employee increased from 36 to 93. Lots of things happened. Also salaries increased by at least double. There were some shortcomings. This just as an example, because I used to teach in the US, I used to have this chart and I just put the Sri Lankan. US also had a monopoly period based on patents, and that ended in 1897. So you can see up to the time the monopoly remained, the US growth was here, and then it shoots up. Radical difference as competition is introduced. Sri Lanka also the same thing. The other thing that was privatized pretty close to SLT was household gas, Shell. And you can see Shell was increasing, but as soon as we introduced competition, SLT's the telecommunication penetration shoots up and overtakes it, and now it has overtaken everything else. 2003, we did an IPO, international exclusivity was ended. I don't think we're going to have time to go through all this. So in the next 5 minutes, let me just flag for you the key points regarding current issues. So the first one, our friend Mr. Sarath Vikram Surya talked to me about this. Wasteful duplication of infrastructure, right? So there are lots of people who think we have too many towers. Anywhere we look, my least favorite, of course, is Atugala. In Kurunegala, when I look up, and there's a bloody tower on top of the rock, right? Why? Couldn't you find some other place? Right? So these aesthetics, but one could argue that, we have beyond the aesthetics problem. Why is it that why are we duplicating? Is it not possible to have less duplication? Not only for towers, but also for cables, instead of digging the road on 2-3 different sides. Everybody's laying fiber. Why can't we have people using the same fiber? And so on, right? So almost every budget in the last few years has been trying to do something about it. Many of them really stupid things, but I can talk about why they are stupid. But they keep trying to control this using taxes and creating companies and various things like that. But anyway, let's look at the basic principle. The basic principle is, we can say, basic infrastructure, that is cables and towers, everybody needs. We can say these should be provided by a the company which has most of the towers and most of the facilities in the ground. That would mean that at the beginning, as competition is introduced, everybody has to buy from the incumbent company. So SLT would be the provider of connectivity for everybody, right? That was the model in the US. All the mobile operators, they could put up their towers, but the towers couldn't be connected using microwave. They had to be connected using cables that the AT&T, the original company, provided. Another model, now that there's a huge problem with that, because the company won't give them proper service and won't give them decent prices. They will try to kill the new competitor. So then in England, they have something, they created carved out a company from British Telecom called BT Openreach. That is part of BT, but it has to keep separate accounts, it can't have, say, common officers, etc. And it has to provide services to anybody who wants. And if you compel that, you need strong regulation. The other one is this principle called build or buy. That is, any engineer who looks at it says, if you can use existing facilities, it would be more economical, cheaper. Why? Why do you want to duplicate facilities? So you say, okay, if that is the case, it should be cheaper. But if you do your own calculations and you see what the costs are in terms of investment, the monthly, quarterly, annual fees that you have to pay, and the service quality that you get. That is, when your system goes down, are you allowed to go and fix it? Because this was a problem in the US. They had separate tariffs for people going into these places, and going in and using the toilet also, there's a separate charge, right? So they have all kinds of restrictions on other people, on their competitors' people coming into these common facilities. So you look at all that and you say, if I have a breakdown, can I fix it quickly, or will my competitor hinder me from fixing it? So based on that, they decide to build or buy. If you do build or buy, there's a certain discipline that comes for that. So this is what I said, abusive practices. So you need strong regulation to control all these things. If you can't have strong regulation, then you most probably will have to do build or buy. Now, this is something we can talk about. I was trying very hard to do fair access to the cable station in Mount Lavinia, the cable station in Colombo, and so on, and didn't quite get the job done. And now Dialog has got its own cable station. Lankabel has got its own cable station. So they have decided to build. They have duplicated. Assignment of spectrum, again, very critical. I think we should finish in about 5 minutes. No? Spectrum is the most important critical thing for wireless broadband, most things. I mean, nowadays, without spectrum, there's no point in talking about. If, for example, we hadn't allowed SLT to take Mobitel, the company would be in very difficult situation today, right? So the important thing about spectrum is, the way to think about spectrum is, you think about spectrum like land. The most valuable land in a city changes. So in the Dutch period, it was Mattakulia Modara, where the richest people lived. Now the poorest people live there, right? The richest people tend to live near water. But then for various reasons, they move away from water, and that becomes occupied by shanties and so on. So in a city, you keep repurposing land. That is, you take land that has sort of gone to low value uses, and you come up with various ways in which you can use it for higher value purposes, right? That is, you resettle people, put them in high rises, take their land, and now do more valuable things with that land. In the same way, spectrum is like that, right? So if you look at most countries in the world, no longer use valuable spectrum in the 700 megahertz band for television, for analog television. We use it for analog television. If that is used for mobile broadband, the government will make a lot of money. We will have much better service, because at that level, the data transmission can go through walls. You can have much better reception. But we are still allowing the old users who don't pay a lot of money to sit there and use it for old purposes. So refarming is taking them, moving them away, and that's very difficult. One of the most difficult things that I've done was clearing the 900 and 800 bands so that SLT could use them. They didn't have those bands, so they could use GSMA. They couldn't use GSM standards. I would say that as a policymaker, as a regulator, that is the most difficult thing that I've done. And perhaps the most rewarding thing was clearing those frequencies in 2002, 2003. So it's a very difficult thing, but it needs to be done. And we're talking about significant amount of payments having to be made to various parties as well. So, as I said, 700 megahertz is still a priority. We have to get that done. Every government comes and postpones it. We have to have some, there are scientific ways of dealing with spectrum. I think we'll stop it at that point. Well, people talk about how much money we can make from spectrum. Even now, the government is making very serious amounts of money from spectrum. If you look at it here, TRC is today one of the biggest contributors to Treasury. Up to August of this year, they have given 7.2 billion, which is more than the total from NSB, People's Bank, and Bank of Ceylon, the governments, the state banks, they had given just by themselves. That's how much they collect on spectrum fees and things like that, that they give. So auctions are a good thing to do. They are the fair thing to do. And then if you do auctions, nobody is going to run around saying, somebody's son and somebody's brother was favored. It means it has been done in a proper manner, optimizing the value for customers. So content regulation is there, but I don't think I can do justice to it now. So, shall we take questions? Do we have questions? Okay, that's about 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Okay. Content regulation. Now, anywhere, I've taught this in the US, I've taught this in the Netherlands, I've taught this subject all over the world. Nowhere does the telecom regulator regulate content. What we say is, we don't regulate what goes through the pipes. We only look after the pipes, right? We don't regulate what goes through the pipes. But in this country, we do. So if you look at all the orders, now I'm just giving you 3 examples. After the Digana incidents in March of 2018, you had the whole world paid attention to that because we shut down Facebook. And because international media doesn't like Facebook, a lot of things were written about us. And even I got an invitation to give an opinion piece in the New York Times, right, on this subject. So then after the Easter bombings, not immediately after the Easter bombings, but Easter bombings happened in April. In May, when the Minwangoda problem started, then we shut down all the social media. April 3rd, this year, the government ordered all the social media, Instagram, TikTok, everything to be shut down, right? For the whole day, because that was a day of protest, April 3rd, Saturday. And they lifted it at 3 p.m. And I knew at that point that the game was over, that this government was not going to last, right? So you can see all those orders, all those instructions came from the TRC. That means the Telecom Regulatory Commission is a content regulator, right? However, It has no capacity to regulate content. By what means, on what basis does it ban this or reactivate that? All it does is that there is a provision in the law which says that for national security, special directives can be given. That's in the law. And it says that the telecom regulator, regulatory commission, must apply its mind, and then it can give directions to the operators. That's it. So it's using those two interlinked powers in the act that content regulation is done. But there's no, we don't know on what basis it's done. So if you look at our constitution, which gives the freedom of speech and expression, and it says, if it is provided by law, these exceptions are allowed. So that means if you say national security, public safety, people are going to set fire to temples and churches and mosques. Of course you can do that, but then you must have law. We don't have any such law, right? We just have that opaque black box process where the Secretary of Defense or somebody writes to these people. I don't know whether they even write or is it just a phone call, right? They send a directive and then that directive is communicated to the operator. So this is a rather unsatisfactory situation which is not fully within the law. So the point that I have made is, as I said, I'm for freedom of expression, but I'm not a person who says that everything in the world has to be free. There are certain situations where you may have to engage in some restrictions, as the Constitution says. I don't have a particular disagreement with the Constitution on that. What I say is, we have to figure out what our objectives are. What do we want to do? If what we want is to prevent violence, then the message that is triggering the violence has to be taken down quickly, immediately, right? A message that a Buddhist temple has been attacked somewhere or a Muslim church has been burnt. That message has to be taken down quickly. To do that, you have to work with the platform operators. The government doesn't have the capability to take down. If what you want is to punish those people, then the government can do it, but it'll take months and years. So the government has got to decide what to do in these cases. And there are various ways in which it can be done. That is, you can have industry codes, you can have various kinds of ways in which it can be done, where we are currently working on these things, and we can propose all these solutions. But the government has to decide what its priorities are.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture, which has given insightful informations, and because we are now in a verge of reforms in several sectors. So that I think what you have delivered, Professor Rohan Samarajiva, is really important on the aspect of IESL as well as engineers, and these are engineering organizations. And he touched about the history of regulatory frameworks in Sri Lanka and overview of Telecommunication Act, the challenges faced by the operationalization of Telecommunication Act, and the way and the directions are what could be the way. I think now shall we start the Q&A session. Before that, I need to introduce our moderator, Mr. Engineer P.W. Sarath. Engineer P.W. Sarath is Vice President of IESL, and he is a former Chief Innovative Officer of SLT. He retired 2 years back, and he is a fellow member of our institution, and also he is an international professional engineer. So let let me invite Engineer P.W. Sarath, uh, who is contacting with us online to do the moderation part. Over to you, Engineer P.W. Sarath.
Wait, sorry, that is my muted. So, Professor Rohan Samraja, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, giving a short notice, and you colorfully, that is, give a good narration about the history of telecom reforms taken place in Sri Lanka. So that is because based on your experience and your that is expertise. Now that I also can remember that as you said that that before that is the regulation took place in the Sri Lanka, that there were huge queues can see near regional telecom offices to get the telephone connection. So those days, the cost of the telecom telephone line was around rupees 25 or 30,000 in 1985, where our salaries, nearly average salaries less than 3,000 most of the times. So only it is just a status, that is the symbol of status, and it's confined to. So Professor Samarjee, that is before that embarking on the other questions, yes, I want to ask that is a little bit on your more expanded views now. Now, in a regulator, that is another role of the regulator, when you in the competitive market even, have the responsibility to manage, to ensure that, sorry, not to manage, but ensure that quality of services are maintained, managed in a meeting the that is defined or meeting the agreed target level expected by the consumers. In your experience, do you think that any operator in Sri Lanka meet that requirement?
Well, to talk about quality of telecommunication services, there are two ways in which we look at it. Sort of one is what can be measured by machines, call drop rates, call completion rates, length to get dial tone, things like that. Those can be just generated by the software in the exchanges themselves. There's another one, which is, when customers call to get to complain, how long does it take their complaints to be addressed, billing disputes, things like that, right? They're more difficult to resolve, to count actually. Now, in the old days, when everything was fixed, or when we are dealing with a fixed telephone network, that first part was manageable. I'm not saying it was good, but the standards were easy to agree on and to enforce. Because if now I can remember there were problems, Piliandala, there was a problem with an exchange. Mount Lavinia, where I used to live, had a horrible old exchange. Sarath, you may remember, and it was almost like a nightmare to get a dial tone of that in 1985-86. So those kinds of things were easy to, they were there, but you could fix them. Now, the problem with mobile telephony is that the operator doesn't control all the features. So if you take a 3G network, the actual coverage will shrink. if too many people, if there's school opening or something like that, and there are lots of vans waiting and everybody is making phone calls, the load on the tower will go up. And the tower will, it used to give connections to like half a mile, and now suddenly it won't give because its capacity is exceeded. So it's very difficult in a wireless environment to give that same kind of quality that we expect in a fixed environment. But anyway, the whole point is that we have to work together, the regulators to work together with all the operators and with consumers through public consultations to set realistic minimum standards and then to hold them accountable to the minimum standards. Now, I'm afraid there were attempts to do that about broadband quality about several years ago, and I have seen that being really pushed in recent times. So probably my answer to you is that that's an area where regulator doesn't seem to be doing enough.
Yes, Professor, because another thing is that is the footprint and the network coverage. That, for example, that I don't want to name the operators, but most of the operators, because I am a regular traveler in highway from Galle to Colombo. In the most of the mobile operators, I can see that in some areas in the highway, there are some pockets that is you cannot get a signal loss and your call breaks up. So even if sometimes that is very dangerous even, because in when you issue a license to the operators, do you think that something they have to meet that is a minimum coverage level in some areas where that they can make an emergency calls, etc. At least, in your opinion, is it happening in the other countries or it is unique for the Sri Lanka as well?
Every country in the world, you have gaps. Every country you have gaps. Now, whether you tolerate the gaps or not is the question. I can remember Mr. Logeswaran, my chairman, I'm the Director General, my chairman, my sort of immediate boss, used to keep telling me that we have to do something about this. But you see, in the early stages, when the mobile networks were rolling out, I think it would have been unreasonable to expect them to do that. But now they've been in business for 20, 30 years. So I think we can expect more of them. I've also heard about this gap in the Southern Highway. There are other gaps. I don't know whether you've seen in Singharaja, there are certain parts of the upper end of Singharaja where you don't have connectivity, and that is because nobody will allow anybody to construct towers in that area. Yeah, these are things that the regulator can look into, but the regulator will also then have to provide the facilities to build towers. Right now, the regulator, at least the country's laws, seem to be discouraging the building of towers. There's a rather excessive fee that has to be built, that has to be paid for every tower. So they're working at cross purposes. I predicted when that came in the 2018 budget, I wrote about it, I criticized it, and I said, if you put this, you will have a deterioration of quality. And in fact, we had a deterioration of quality. When these kids were trying to connect to their schools during that period, that was a big problem because they had pulled back on tower investments. Sarath, can I take these two questions that came on the chat?
Okay.
So the first question was about 5-year spectrum outlook. Very sadly, that is not available. So under our international agreement, that is with the World Trade Organization, we have signed a commitment to do certain things. Telecommunications is subject to those rules. Our master register must be public. And in 2002, with great difficulty, I wasn't in the Regulatory Commission at the time, I was in the ministry. I managed to persuade the regulator to publish the master register. So with the master register, I'm not talking about the master plan. Huh? This says 5-year spectrum outlook. That's the roadmap. What are we planning to do in the next 5 years? I'm saying even before that, the master register, who has what spectrum, should be public. If you don't want to say which particular frequency defense is using for what purpose, that you can hide. But that this whole block has been given to defense, that is okay to be published. Everybody in the world does that. So we managed to get that done, but then a few years after that, the Telecommunication Regulatory Commission redid their website, and in the new website, that particular segment was gone. So there is a great objection, I would say, I'm looking for the right word, resistance, hesitancy to have the master register public. I mean, people can give various interpretations to it. I'm just saying, right or wrong, it's a international legal obligation that we have, and it should be done. Then the second question, I went through that very quickly. On this slide, actually you can't see the slide, that's okay. When I say that you should do spectrum reforming, that is taking low value spectrum and putting it to high value users, you have to allow people to plan ahead. So I'll use that as in this particular way. Part of the reforming that we did for the 900 and 1800 bands in 2003, 2004 was that we told people that these slots will be available, that we are clearing these frequencies and they will be available for GSM users. So right at the beginning, some of the companies, Mobitel, for example, which had no GSM frequencies, immediately took what was allowed. But other companies waited because they had confidence that the spectrum would be available next year. So that is the value of a roadmap, or as this gentleman says, what's it called? Outlook. So it allows company to plan. And if you are conducting auctions, which we don't, the only auction we conducted was for 1800 spectrum in 2003, as far as I can remember. I was involved in that with a base price of 3 million or something like that. But as long as you are conducting auctions, it's very important to give this outlook. So since we are not conducting auctions, we are not also giving an outlook. This is an area that we really need to pay attention if we are serious about managing spectrum efficiently. So that is that question. International inbound phone calls to, oh yes, Kusal Lap asked question. International inbound calls, I don't know why anybody is making international inbound calls. I no longer make international calls in the conventional way when there's WhatsApp. Why would people want to make calls, right? Unless the person you're trying to reach doesn't have a smartphone, right? Because if you call somebody on WhatsApp, no charges. The reason why it is expensive is because a decision that was taken to step down termination calls to 0 or 1 cent or something like that has not been implemented. When we did the international liberalization in 2003, we said it has to be stepped down in 5 years to the cost of a local call. If you bring it down to that level, then there's no difference between terminating an international call and a local call. and all these bypass and black money and all that business would have gone away. But for some reason, the government didn't follow through with that decision. So because of that, there is a government mandated termination rate for incoming calls. And because of that, it may be that calls to Sri Lanka are more expensive than they should be. But as I said at the beginning, I don't know why anybody is making voice calls to Sri Lanka when you have the ability to use WhatsApp and Signal and God knows what else. Regulation. What are the negatives? I think this is disadvantages of regulation of telecom. Oh, you know, when you talk about regulation, in my teaching, I talk about traffic lights. So I ask my students, give them 3 scenarios. Traffic lights, everybody knows traffic lights, red lights, green lights, etc. So there's one scenario where there are no traffic lights, right? People just go across intersections any way they want, right? Then there's another scenario where there are traffic lights, right? And however, they don't work well. Sometimes both sides are giving green, right? And this has happened to me in Colombo. Kanatta intersection, both sides were green, right? So I immediately called, right? Because, right, both sides are green. So I immediately called 1919 or whoever, and I said, what the hell is wrong? This is, I have to complain to somebody because both sides are green, right? So that means it's a regulatory scheme. Now you understand what I'm trying to get at. Traffic lights are a way of regulating traffic, right? Regulation is a way of regulating an infrastructure industry. So you can have a situation where there's no regulation. You can have a situation where there's regulation, but it doesn't work well. And you can have a third situation where it works well, right? So I think it's not, we don't need to have a lot of dispute about the third situation being better than the other two. That is, traffic lights that are properly functioning are better than no traffic lights, right? And having no regulation. But then the question is poorly functioning or badly functioning traffic lights better than having no traffic lights? What are your thoughts? Yeah, because if it doesn't work well, it's very, very dangerous. Because I'm driving and I think I'm, you know, I think I know the rules of the road. Green is green, I go through. But suddenly green is not green because some other fellow has got green and he's also coming. So it's very, very dangerous. So that is the whole point. That's why I said regulation is something that has to be done very, very carefully, according to the law, according to following all the procedures. Regulation has to be accountable. That is, under the law, you have to do everything the way it's set out. So I think I mentioned that case of Sri Lanka Telecom having to pay back to the public of this country about the equivalent of about $1 million US. I purposely don't say it's a fine. They had collected money from people, deposits, advanced payments, and they weren't giving connections. They were incapable of giving connections because they were trying to get some kind of management fee or something. And they had problems with their suppliers, but they had collected all this money because they didn't want people to go to Suntel or Lankabel, right? If they take 14,000 or, you know, very large amount of money by those standards, the full connection fee had to be paid. So they took the money, but they weren't giving connections. So this was completely against the existing tariff. So we said, now we said you have to give it back and you have to give the connection. So connection for free and you have to give back the money. But in order to do that, we followed the rule book sentence by sentence, comma by comma. That is, we gave them notice, we sent them letters by registered post, handed over, we gave them 2 weeks time to respond, and when the 2 weeks was interpreted not to include Sundays and so on, said, you have 2 weeks to respond, do respond. So we followed all the rules of fairness and natural justice until we came to this conclusion. That's what a regulator has to do. A regulator has to be fair. A regulator who is not fair, who doesn't work by the rule book, is a bad regulator, and they can do more damage than having no regulation, which is why I think I would prefer to have a situation where there's no traffic lights to one where I can't tell whether the traffic lights are giving me the right guidance or not. So that I have answered, this I have answered. I think that's it. 3 questions, right? Only 3, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
There's only 3 questions. Yes, Professor, that one more that I think I want to say about, as you said, that is the building of towers nowadays. Actually, it is a very huge cost, and that is it involves a lot of that is we have to get a lot of which means approvals. But that is why now 5G concept came in, because based on the 5G concept, actually we don't need to have that is the big tower, huge towers. So only thing is, then when 5G is introduced, the lamp post or some other telephone post can be used as towers. But what is your opinion in Sri Lanka? Why we got delayed to implement 5G commercially? Is it a spectrum issue?
Well, when you're talking about what he says is very interesting, because you see, one reason why the towers in the cities go up high is because they're still trying to use microwave. If you get rid of microwave, you don't have to go that high, right? So ideally, all the towers will be connected using fiber, right? They'll collect the calls from the customers, but then from there to the exchange, they'll be going through fiber. That's how it should be. And now increasingly that's happening in Colombo, right? So when you talk about 5G and lampposts, that is very important. Street light poles are going to become very valuable property, right? Because you can hang antenna on them very close to the end user in heavily trafficked areas. I'm still not saying that in Mullatiu and various other places you still will see big towers, because they want to cover a lot of geography using that. So they will use, but then you have the next question. You can't be using microwave to connect lampposts. So that means you have to take fiber down all the streets. That means right of way becomes more important than it used to be, right? So instead of having fiber digs, trenches on the 2 sides of the road, you probably will have to go wherever the lampposts are in the same way. So I think this is a case where electricity board or and telecommunication people will have to cooperate very closely, where the electric cables and the fiber should be running together, right? So that, I think, is something we haven't really thought about. There are people who are thinking about it and who've been trying to lock CMC and various municipalities into various kinds of exclusive contracts on lampposts, which trouble me a lot. But I'm not a regulator now, so I can only be troubled. I can't do anything about it, right? So those kinds of things have to be looked at. The whole problem, Sarath, is, I think, our spectrum management is not proactive. We are not looking ahead. That's why I said the only refarming we did is 20 years ago. After that, I don't think we've done any refarming. That means we have to clear frequencies. Like I said, with urban land, you clear frequencies, make them empty, and then you bid them out, you auction them out to people. And on 5G, I think we have a bit of a situation where it's not settled quite yet. Should 5G be within building applications? Now, for example, in India, Adani has taken the 5G frequencies for in-building applications, factories, machines talking to each other, Internet of Things, they have used it for that. They are not asking it to be used for ordinary consumers. So I think the technology is still not settled. So I wouldn't get too worried about that part of it. But I think if it is coming, particularly if you have vehicles, even today, some of the modern vehicles, the engine can be talking to its parent, the tires can be talking to somebody else, the battery can be talking to somebody else. So these things are communicating devices. So if you are going to do that, Internet of Things is coming, we better get ready. And that's when 5G really becomes important, not for our communications. For our communications, 4G is plenty, I think, right? But if we want to get into that, we have to think ahead. So we have to have some kind of foresight unit, either in government or in the regulatory agency. And I'm afraid we don't seem to have that.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. That should be the way. Actually, that is we should, when we talk about the digital economy, that is 5G or 6G or whatever said and done. Actually, that is we can manage many things through IoT. That is most productive way. As you said, yes, that is all the operators and the regulator should sit together and work together to achieve this milestone. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, I mean, this question that's remaining about treating 5G as an advancement of 4G, I don't think so. I think 5G has got qualitatively different characteristics. After all, I'm a regulator, right? I mean, you're asking me engineering questions. Uh, but it has got enough differences. I used to laugh about, 2G and 3G. Not a really big difference between 2G and 3G. It was more marketing than anything else. But when you go to 5G, I think there are some real differences, latency and so on, that it is used for other things like IoT, things talking to things, not human beings. So I think it's a different ecosystem. And as I said, if you are really going to optimize the value of 5G, we have to think about in-building uses, factory uses. And also we have to think about the whole fiber issue becomes extraordinarily important, unlike in the other cases. So I think that's about the answer I can give to that. Okay. Right. Thank you. Sorry for rushing through some of the slides, but the slides are available if anybody wants to look at them. And
So thank you, Professor Samarajiva and Engineer B.W. Sarath for conducting the Q&A as well. So we are coming into the conclusion. So before the vote of thanks, I would like to invite Dr. Kamal Laksiri to give away the tokens of appreciation to Professor Rohan Samarjiva. Thank you very much, Dr. Kamal Laksiri. Now I invite Engineer Hashita Chaminda. He's an engineer from Sri Lanka Telecom Enterprise Business Development. He's a member of IESL and a member of our sectional committee. Engineer Hashita, can you please come and then deliver the vote of thanks?
Thank you, Engineer Jamil. A very good evening to all the distinguished guests and our guest speaker and all the participants who are joining here and from online. It is an honor to deliver the vote of thanks at the end of this very informative and fruitful webinar on a timely topic, role of a telecom regulator to transform the country to a digital economy, which is conducted in hybrid mode. On behalf of the Electrical, Electronics and Telecommunication Engineering Sectional Committee of Institution of Engineers, Sri Lanka, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guest speaker, Professor Rohan Samarjeeva, founding chair of Learn Asia, former chairman of the ICT Agency of Sri Lanka, and former Director General of the Telecommunication Regulatory Commission of Sri Lanka. We are truly privileged to have you here for sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience with us today. And I felt that we are running out of time, and if we would have more time, it would be very nice to get more out of you, sir. Thank you very much. I must thankful to our moderator, Engineer P.W. Sarath, Vice President of ISL and former Deputy Chief Officer of Sri Lanka Telecom, for your wonderful service to keep the liveliness throughout the webinar. Our special thanks shall be extended to Engineer P.W. Sarath for his contribution to coordinate with our guest speaker to make this webinar a success. My sincere gratitude shall be extended to the President of ISL, Engineer Dr. Kamal Laksiri, for always being with us, supporting us, and guiding us to accomplish our objectives. And also, I would like to extend my gratitude to Engineer M.R. Ranatunga, former Deputy General Manager, former General Manager of Ceylon Electricity Board, Engineer Kusum Shanti, Deputy General Manager, Transmission Design of Ceylon Electricity Board, and Engineer Neil Abhisekara, CEO of ISL. Also, I must be thankful to the staff of ISL for their support in various ways to plan and deliver this event. Without their support, we would not be able to make this a reality. Finally, I would like to thank each and every one of you being present here and joining online to make this webinar a fruitful and memorable one. Thank you all once again.